If you are pregnant or you've recently had a baby, this podcast is for you. I am your host, Kath Bequee, a physiotherapist working in women's health and mum of 3. Join me each week as we dive into all things pregnancy care, childbirth and postnatal recovery, helping you have a wonderful pregnancy and afterbirth experience. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Well, hi there. Welcome to episode 26 of the Fitness Mama podcast. I am your host, Kath Bequee. I'm a mum of 3 young girls, a physiotherapist for women, and I have an online community, Fitness Mama, which helps to provide pregnant and new mothers with the exercises, support, and resources they need to move from the overwhelm, the physical aches and pains of pregnancy, the weakness felt after birth, and instead we replace that with the comfort and confidence they need to get their bodies and minds strong again, so that they can get back to doing what they love with a bubba by their side, whether or not that's running around with the kids at the park or running the next marathon. So today on the podcast is a super interesting discussion, which I could argue that all women should listen to. I was a bit worried heading into this interview, as I have to confess I know nothing about kinesiology, energy and moons. And to be totally honest, I was worried this conversation might be a bit woo-woo for me. But let me assure you, it's not. I am interviewing the lovely Ilana, who is a kinesiologist, energy coach and a yoga and meditation teacher. Ilana discusses the transition from being an accountant for years before diving into all things kinesiology. So stick around to the end of this interview as Ilana gives some great practical tips for women, whether or not they're 6 weeks postnatal with a toddler running around, or perhaps you're trying to conceive. And these tips she gives, these practical tips, will help you to balance your energy levels and mood depending on where you are in your cycle, to help you get the most out of every day, but also every month. So before I do jump into this episode, I just want to let you know that the 7-day free trial is available for Fitness Mama. So in this 7-day free trial, you are able to try one of our weekly live Pilates classes, do as many on-demand classes as you'd like, binge listen to guest expert speakers discussing topics including hypnobirthing, induction, mindset, and more. And there's also heaps of Q&A sessions with myself on all sorts of topics such as abdominal muscle separation, pregnancy-related pelvic pain, cesarean scar massage, pelvic floor mastitis, and more. All you need to do is head to www.fitnessmama.com/free. All right, let's get into the show. Hello, Ilana, and welcome to the Fitness Mama podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It is an amazing opportunity to be here, and I'm excited.
Before we get started, do you mind introducing yourself and let us know who you are and what you do? Because I do have to confess, I don't know much about kinesiology. So when you mentioned, the people you work with and the things you do, I was like, wow, that sounds so fascinating. I have to get you on and learn more. So for those who don't know you, who are you?
I wasn't always a kinesiologist, yoga and meditation teacher. My career journey actually started in finance. So I was a finance analyst for nearly 12 years. Working in accounting and finance for the electricity industry. So I'm originally from Gippsland, like Morwell, Traralgon, Gippsland area. I now live in Bayside, Melbourne. And I did 9 years of studying. I studied part-time and worked full-time straight out of high school. Got a traineeship down at one of the power stations down in Gippsland, which is predominantly in that Morwell, Traralgon areas. A main industry is power stations. But I knew I always wanted to study, and I didn't know what I wanted to study, but I loved numbers, so I just went with it. Because I think that happens when we go to high school, and sometimes we don't actually know what we want to do. I was a yes person. I took a lot of responsibility at work. I kind of worked my way through different sectors of finance, but I was very bad at taking annual leave and taking my RDOs And as I was saying, I always put my hand up for like extracurricular activities. And outside of work, I was always at the gym and socializing. In the beginning, I had a couple of part-time jobs as well. I burnt out by 30. And prior to my burnout story, I had started seeing a chiropractor because I had this right foot ankle problem that would not go away. And they said, cortisone isn't working, you're going to have surgery, but there's no guarantee. And I was talking to a friend and she's like, go and see this chiropractor who does applied kinesiology. And I was like, okay, I have no idea what that is. And kinesiology, if you don't know what it is muscle testing, muscle monitoring. So our bodies are lovely little blueprints that remember every single thing that has ever happened to us. And we also, as some people may or may not have heard this term, even epigenetics, we inherit a lot of stuff from our parents and our grandparents. And the body holds some of that cellular DNA. So what kinesiology does is if you're feeling stressed, for instance, or you're trying to get pregnant, or you have menstrual cycle problems or emotional imbalances, or you want to quit your job, for instance, I'm just giving scenarios, and there's a lot of stress or fear there, or back pain, for instance, and you've been to chiropractors and, masseuse and nothing is healing. We tap into your body and say, hey, body, what the hell is going on? How can I bring the body back to homeostasis? The body always wants to be in this balanced sort of state of health, really. Like the body's always, like even when we cut ourselves, it's always trying to heal. So we're always trying to find this homeostasis and equilibrium. And so when I went to see an applied kinesiologist, he mainly works with physical aspects of the body, whereas I work more holistic, which is basically every single avenue of your life. Finances and health and well-being and hormones if you're a woman, and lifestyle and money stress and environmental factors, because any of that could be causing an imbalance at any time, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually, physically as well. I started seeing this guy and my ankle pain went away.
How can you test someone's muscle and find out about all those things?
Basically, it comes back to the sort of quantum physics, or it's kind of scientific sort of explanation of we're all just a form of energy, really. Even the chair we're sitting on is a form of energy that's just been slowed down enough to create a solid form. And so some things in life allow us to have a high frequency of energy and some things are low. And if we're stressed, do you think you're high or you're low? That vibration, if you're there long enough, causes dis-ease or disharmony or imbalance. Does that make sense? Which then causes symptoms, anxiety or overwhelm or back pain or whatever it might be. So it's about raising your energy vibration a little bit and bringing this sense of harmony back to the body. Yeah, so that's kind of what we do, but we do it through muscle testing. Now, I work like face-to-face and I also work online. I'd started working online prior to COVID, then COVID hit, and it was like, well, my whole business then went online for a little while. And the way it works online is because we are just forms of energy and I'm just tapping into your energy field, I surrogate muscle test for you. So I'm testing myself while I'm working with a client. And they're blown away by what I tell them quite often. Like I might say, what happened at age 3? Or did your parents, what happened, at age 25? And they're like, well, my parents got divorced. How the hell would she know that? And it still works over the internet, because sometimes we have to go back and heal things from the past a little bit. Not that we have to dive in like a psychologist and analyze or anything. We just have to shift the energy to bring this balance back. And then once the body has what it needs, quite often the pain will go away, which was what happened with me. Or your anxiety reduces, or you get pregnant miraculously when you've been trying for ages.
So much of what you said rings true in terms of, mental health and physical health are so well aligned, and your emotional well-being ties into your physical well-being. And I guess this is why I have loved creating this podcast, is because it introduces you to people who you perhaps wouldn't have. I can't say I've worked with a kinesiologist before or had much to do with it. So do you mind if I dive into a few questions? So when you talk about muscle energy, so coming from a physiotherapist perspective, when we talk about muscle energy, if we were assessing someone's muscle, we'd be assessing their strength and their endurance and their length and all those physical attributes. What are you referring to when you talk about muscle testing? This episode is brought to you by Baby Bee, Australian-owned and designed prams combining quality, safety and style. Not only does Baby Bee let you try their prams at home with free returns for 9 months, yes, that's 9 months, they also offer an industry-leading 3-year warranty for total peace of mind. With thousands of 5-star reviews, around-the-clock customer care, and up to $300 of free accessories with every pram, what are you waiting for? Go visit www.babybeeonline.com and check them out for yourself. And yes, for listeners of the podcast, there is a 20% discount code. Enter FITBEE, FITBEE 20 at checkout, and T's and C's apply.
In terms of muscle testing, we're not testing how strong you are. We're testing the energetic strength, usually to a question or a goal. So, for instance, one of your goals might be, I easily fall pregnant this year. And so I would ask your body that statement. If it was true, and if the body says, yes, you can easily get pregnant, your arms would stay nice and strong. Like, yes, I'm in alignment with this. Does that make sense? If there was some subconscious or unconscious doubts, or, there's some nutrition deficiency, or your hormones aren't in sync, or you're not sleeping properly, or there's a lot of stress that is sort of perhaps part of the story why you're having issues getting pregnant, your muscles, when I went to test them, would weaken. And I'd be able to push your arms down really easily. So that's what we're talking about with muscle testing. It's usually in relation to a goal or intention that we're working with. And it's the same if, like, for instance, if I got your listeners, don't do this if you're driving in a car, but if you closed your eyes for a moment and you thought about something that you loved or enjoyed, how does that make you feel? Usually you have a sense of love or connection or inspired or motivated. And then think about something that's stressing you. You usually feel heavy, anxious, overwhelmed, burdened, whatever it might be. Now, sometimes unconsciously, because kinesiology taps into the unconscious, because sometimes you're not highly aware of what the block or the problem is that's causing the stress. And if we're going, for instance, with the example of trying to get pregnant, there could be some unconscious things that you're telling yourself or past experiences that haven't fully been felt or haven't fully been processed. Maybe you've had a prior miscarriage that hasn't been completely resolved, or you're picking up something from your mum or your own birth story, like when you actually came into the world. That can sometimes be a blockage that stops you from creating that goal or desire that you're wanting. And so we go and figure out, well, what is it, through the muscle testing. And the muscles, it's not how strong you are, it's how energetically aligned you are to that goal or intention. And then we're trying to bring it back to that balance and equilibrium so that it can become true. I suppose a little bit like manifesting what you're desiring, but using your body, like using what it is within your body and your lifestyle to make sure that you're aligning to that.
So do you have women who perhaps have gone through the medical model and struggled to conceive, and once they've, been through the doctors and the medication and all those things, then they think, right, what else can I try? And that's when they might try with kinesiology?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a combination. Some women, if they know what kinesiology is and they've had experience before, might use it leading into conception because they want to let go of any limiting beliefs or fears about becoming a mum or the actual birth itself. But then I also have women that come to me, and this is probably just people in general, who come to me as like a last resort quite often, because kinesiology is, it is starting to grow, but it's still a very unknown modality a little bit. They're like, I'm doing all the right things. And sometimes what happens is that is the stress in itself, the IVF, and the results, and being told by doctors that you can't, when of course you can. You know, there's a very small percentage, I think, of women who are actually barren. It's usually lifestyle, or there's something going on, and we figure out what that is together in a supportive environment, because you do go to doctors quite often and they just tell you like textbook, unless you're seeing like an integrated GP or a naturopath or working with someone, because I work a lot with cycles, women's cycles anyway, that there's a lot of things out there that we're quite often not told.
Coming from a bit of more of a medical model, I think we've got to be careful that generally, you know, as physios, we like to do stuff that's got evidence behind it. There's randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews and all those sorts of things. But I do need to keep bringing myself back to the fact that just because there's no evidence for it doesn't mean it doesn't work.
Well, it's mind, body, soul. Does that make sense? Like we all have a soul, we all have a spirit too, and we all have a connection that can't always be explained. It's like a little bit like yoga and meditation are now starting to have scientific research, and even like acupuncture, that it's now being proven that we actually have acupuncture lines. And I work a lot with the meridian system. That's taken a long time for that to be proved.
It's been used for thousands of years, and we're only, like, research is now catching up. So maybe that in the future will hopefully be the case with kinesiology too, so that we can get some evidence behind its effectiveness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's go on then. So when you talk about energy levels and menstrual cycles, please do explain.
This is probably my topic passion at the moment, because this is stuff we should have learnt when we first bled. Like, this is stuff we should have learned in high school. And something that I'm actually passionate about is creating something for that generation. But basically, as women, we do not work on a 24-hour cycle. Our energy is not the same every single day. Men work on a 24-hour cycle. Their main hormone is testosterone, and it kind of rises like cortisol. It rises in the morning, you know, it peaks at lunchtime, we have the little afternoon dip, we have a little rise at nighttime, and then it dips again before we go to sleep. And their testosterone does the same. Ours depends on our hormones. And so every week of our cycle, our hormones are doing different things. Every week of our cycle, we have a different energy, and different emotions quite often are associated with these hormonal fluctuations. So our cycle is really, or our energy cycle is our menstrual cycle. So it's that 29 average, if you actually have a 29, anywhere from probably 25 days to 35 days is usually what they class as more of an like normal period cycle. So we as women should be following energetically how we're feeling each and every week, depending on where we are in our cycle, not trying to keep up with the 24-hour clock, which society has basically taught us. Does that make sense? And when we try and keep up with the 24-hour clock rather than our biological clock, that's when we get exhausted and burnt out. And, you know, then we have the stories of, I'm not doing enough, or I feel over responsible. And we quite often shut down what we need and what our emotions and our intuition and our wisdom is telling us each and every day. So working with our cycle, and the reason why the moon comes into play here is the moon is a 29-day cycle. And the first calendar was created for the menstrual cycle based on the moon. Our calendar system has come from traditionally from the moon and us menstruating, not for our day-to-day lives, which is pretty fascinating.
But if it's all based on the moon, why aren't we all menstruating at the same time?
Because everyone's cycle isn't bang on 29 days. And also because we've gone from living outside to artificial light. Like if you had back in the day, like when that was created, everyone was living really in sync with nature, which is a lot of us aren't that connected now with the moon.
So do you think people were more in sync with their menstrual cycles years ago.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot of readings around like red tents, for instance. So women, when they would bleed, and I'll get to a little bit more of that in a moment, would go into these tents and basically have 3 or 4 days to rest and recharge. They would be fed.
That sounds nice.
Our menstrual week is actually in alignment with new moon. So if you're not bleeding, if you're pregnant or you're perimenopause and kind of have an inconsistent cycle, because that can happen when you move into perimenopause or like you are in menopause, you follow the moon as your cycle rather than your bleed. Does that make sense? So regardless of if you're bleeding or not bleeding, as a woman, we have these natural sort of forces or ways of living that most of us haven't been taught to live in more sync with our hormones and with nature. So we have the 4 phases. We have week 1, 2, 3, and 4, obviously, because most cycles are around that 28 to 29 days. And they follow the same sort of seasons that we have every single year. So we have a winter phase, a spring phase, a summer phase, and an autumn phase. And you can probably guess what winter phase is.
The week of, or the week before?
No, it's bleeding week. So that would be your red tent week, if, back in where you would take a couple of days off to rest and recharge. Now, that's obviously not going to really, to that extent, happen in most people's lives that listen to this podcast. But
especially if they've got young, like a toddler.
Yes, exactly. But you might say to your husband or, educate your family, my period's coming up. These 2 days, you're going to have to worry about the food. So it's starting to create boundaries and new structures in your lifestyle a little bit. You're like planning your calendar. So I now plan my entire business calendar around my cycle, because if I rest or give myself permission to rest a little bit more in the first couple of days of my bleed, I have more energy throughout my cycle. But if I keep pushing like through this sort of 24 hours, and never sort of make enough time to rest and recharge, then you're in this constant sort of flux all the time of not listening to what your body is needing. Because when we're bleeding, our hormones are at their absolute lowest, which also happens postpartum. It's a very similar energy to have just given birth. I mean, obviously you're producing hormones like prolactin to produce milk and things, but your progesterone and your estrogen quite often are quite flat, and then they slowly start to rise. So spring week is obviously the second week, so your energy is starting to rise a little bit. And how we usually feel in spring, it's like cleansing and clearing, and we can eat foods that feel more spring. So when I teach women to work in alignment and sync with their cycles, we're sort of also eating foods and doing exercise that also links in with these 4 seasons. So when you're bleeding, should we really go and run a marathon? It's not advised. And I can't remember, there's a soccer team over in the US now that they align their training regime for their players, women's soccer team, based on the menstrual cycle.
That's actually happening more and more in Australia too, with the women's AFL. It is quite interesting, all those changes.
Because our summer and our spring are our yang energy. We have the most energy. We feel like being social, for instance. It's the time of the month, if you've got a business, that you do events or be more on social media, because you're at your peak energetically and hormonally. And then it tapers off sort of into autumn, which is almost that premenstrual week, which half of it you're usually tapering off from your summer, so your energy is not too bad. It's sort of like that 4 or 5 days before you bleed, you feel that drop of hormone level again, and you're almost like ready to bleed. Quite often it's the time of the month where most people want to divorce their partners or their husbands, and they have this pattern every month. It's just your hormones, because you're wanting that inward energy, like you're wanting hot baths or you're wanting more space to yourself. You don't want to be touched. You just want to be left alone before you bleed.
What you're saying to me, like thinking of my friends, I know some of them are really quite affected by their cycle, whereas others, and I don't feel like I do have a few days beforehand where I know I get a bit more irritable. But it's really interesting. Do you feel that this works better for some women rather than others, depending on how they are? Or do you think all women should be doing this?
I mean, my belief is probably all women to a degree should be really conscious of where they are in their cycle, because sometimes, even though you still get emotional or thought patterns sometimes that happen at specific times of the month. So if you go into doubt or overwhelm or denial, for instance, it could be like, hang on, I'm the week before my period, I can let it go. It's just where I am in my cycle, rather than perhaps going down a little bit of a spiral and not realizing where your hormone shift is too. Our menstrual cycle as women is basically a way of telling you where your health is at. It's a barometer. Like if you've got really severe PMS, or you have really severe emotional things before your period, or you've got really heavy cramps, for instance, or your cycle's less than that sort of 25 days, or, you know, more than that sort of 35, 36 day, then your body's trying to tell you something. Something's skew with. Is it my diet? Is it my sleep? Is it my stress levels? And working with your cycle in this way brings awareness and, I suppose, a guide to living life in a modern world, but still sort of getting those self-care needs and living more in sync with your hormones as well.
Right. So if you were trying to conceive, you would say this is all extra important, right?
Absolutely. A lot of women, when they try and conceive, have absolutely no idea about their hormones and what they do and what hormones. I mean, a lot of them know that the middle of the month is probably when I ovulate. But like if you're having problems, then we're looking at, well, what part of the cycle might be affecting that, and then what lifestyle things might be affecting that as well, or environmental. So it's a really simple way of, I suppose, living life as a woman and learning more about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think a lot of pregnant women who are trying to conceive spend most attention on the ovulation phase? So like that's summer, is it, when you're talking about the season, summer?
Yeah.
Whereas women should also be paying attention to the autumn and the spring and the winter, right?
Because, you know, if you don't have enough off, which a lot of women don't, we don't have enough of the yin. We're very yang in especially Western society. You know, we're looking after families. We all work generally these days. We have more burdens and responsibilities than our mothers and our grandmothers. We don't have enough of the resetting of the nervous system, the rest and digest, and that is a huge factor in pregnancy and conception.
And I can imagine as the age for pregnancy gets older, we also naturally have more responsibilities and, you know, jobs that are more stressful, and as the age of conception gradually increases over the years. Really interesting.
Yeah, and it just means that as women, because we are doing more things, the more we do, the more we have to give back to self. And a lot of women are missing that part. Like, yeah, you can have all these things, but you will get to a burnout or exhaustion phase, or an issue with your cycle, or another symptom, or finding it hard to perhaps conceive if there's not enough of refueling.
For sure, I can see that. So that's great for anyone here who's listening, who's looking to conceive. Everything that you're discussing now, how does that relate if you're pregnant and you don't have a menstrual cycle, or if you're breastfeeding and your cycle hasn't yet returned? So
you would follow the energy of the moon. So new moon would be, which is actually today while we're recording.
Okay, so that's, what is it, the 13th of March?
Yeah, and I actually have a calendar that people can go and purchase and download on my website. So it basically tells you when the moon is falling. But yeah, new moon is like your week one. And then first quarter moon is obviously start of week 2, and then full moon is your ovulation week, and then third quarter moon would be your autumn phase. And then it just, because the moon we're constantly in this, like, we're cyclical. Women are cyclical, and I think that's kind of what I was getting at with the 24-hour clock and, you know, the women's energy is we're cyclical beings. And if you're pregnant or breastfeeding or in that postpartum kind of energy, or even just conceived, you follow the energy of the moon. And so you're still working within these 4 sort of seasons, but you're following the energy of the moon. And a lot of women are impacted by the moon. So new moon and full moon, quite often you might be, depending on astrology where the sun and all the planets are, you might feel more irritated, you might feel more anxious, emotions might get out of check. I know a lot of women quite often don't sleep around a full moon, and sometimes also a new moon, because Yin is feminine, which is actually tied with the moon, which is why the moon sort of ties in with this whole menstrual cycle discussion that we're having.
Oh, Ilana, you're blowing my mind.
Well, this is why I'm so passionate, because when I learned this, I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. Why did I not know this?
Like what you're saying, yes, I agree. It does make sense, but it's a totally different concept. Like I feel like I've got a good base knowledge with hormones, but yeah, what you're saying does make sense. So if you're someone like myself who's like before today knew nothing, really, like I have heard about, I have been really interested in what's happening with the WAFL, for example. For those who aren't in Australia, that's the Women's AFL League, so the main football league. And I have been really interested in hearing the developments that are happening with their training sessions, for example, based on their cycle. So I am definitely really interested in all that. And I have been hearing more and more in the last year, 12, 24 months probably, about what you're talking about, but I've not really given it too much thought. So if you're someone like me who's a little bit of a cynic, but in a very nice way, or more ignorant perhaps rather than a cynic, what would be your first few steps to trialing this out, giving it a bit of a test, like seeing how I can enhance my, I don't know, life? That's probably the wrong term to use. But yeah, what are some tips?
Well, I suppose the first thing would be to track your cycle. So do you actually know today, for those listening, do you know what day of your cycle you are? So I'm day 17.
Ilana, that's just another thing on the to-do list with 3 kids.
But there's apps. You just download an app and it tells you.
What's your favourite app?
There's a few. I use, this one's a free one called a P Tracker, but there's also Clue.
P Tracker?
Yeah. There's like My Flow, there's Clue, there's thousands of them.
So day 17, so I've caught you in summer. So this is a good time to be doing the podcast.
Absolutely. So because I'm in my peak energy, and that's why I'm going to work in Gippsland next week, because I have the energy to, and I'm running an event tomorrow. I'm running a women's workshop tomorrow because I'm peak.
Do you not organise podcast interviews and workshops and stuff when you're menstruating? Wow.
Nope. And I generally try not to see clients those 2 days. So my whole business now is structured around my menstrual cycle, because I need to give to me a little bit more those days. It doesn't mean that I'm not doing admin or I'm not doing other things, but, we're shedding blood. Our hormones are at their lowest. We can still function and we can still help our family and we can still cook and do those things. But it's really about being as compassionate as we can around those times. And so, no, I do not do anything for that 4 or 5 day window. I don't do as much as I can.
What tips do you have then for the new mum who's listening with a 6-week-old newborn? They've got a toddler who's attached to them 24/7. What words of advice do you have for her to try to work this into her cycle?
Yeah, I would just figure out where she is in the moon and know that, every week of a calendar month, or depending on where the moon is, that her energy may change because of this sort of syncing with the moon a little bit. But I would say, figure out obviously where the moon is. So download an app or get yourself a calendar, pop it on your fridge. And it's not that you have to completely change your life. It's really about awareness. So for instance, this week is menstrual week. So you might perhaps try and fit in a 5 or 10 minute meditation more that doesn't take a lot of time, but just refuels you a little bit, for instance. Menstrual week quite often also is about eating really nourishing sort of soul foods like soups or stews and those kinds of things as well. Obviously, it's hard when you have a toddler and a newborn to give to yourself, but just micro little things that you can do to enhance your energy depending on where you are in the moon, where the moon is in your cycle.
Yeah, it's right, because I come from a different angle, but all my members, I say to them, every time you do exercise, it should leave you feeling invigorated and not exhausted. So for some weeks and days, you might choose just some rejuvenating stretches and really gentle exercises, and then other days you might have the energy to do a full workout. And I guess what I'm saying and what you're saying is the same sort of thing, but just coming at it from different angles.
Yeah, so it's basically, for instance, menstrual week, you might just do a restorative yoga and a yoga nidra meditation, which is like having a 3-hour nana nap in half an hour, which is what I mainly teach in my Aligned Living membership, which basically teaches you how to do this. And then, the next week you might have a little bit more energy. So then you might do that Pilates class, or as you're moving into that sort of spring phase, that's in alignment with the moon. And then, summer would be, you might feel like going for a bit of a walk or a bit more of a jog, if that's kind of your exercise. And then it tapers off again, obviously, before the new moon. So very similar, but just in a different way.
And I'm thinking practically as well, you might, if you've got a newborn and a 6-week-old, for example, you might organise most of your catch-ups with friends and everything in those 2.
Yeah, leading up to the full moon and then tapering off. Because, you will find naturally you will have weeks where you do feel like socialising. But the week prior to bleeding or the week of bleeding, you wouldn't, or the new moon sort of energy. So, yeah.
Interesting. Right. I'm going to start tracking my cycles and I'll get back to you.
I mean, a lot of women, obviously, if they're trying to conceive, start to pay more attention, because sometimes they're obviously doing the basal body temperature to see when their hormones shift for the ovulation, and they're popping them in apps and stuff. So it is becoming more of a mainstream, I suppose. I mean, there's still a lot of work to do, but podcasts like this is what sort of starts that chain reaction.
Yeah, and I can totally see how, I guess, science and what's the other word? But they're sort of coming together.
The other thing you could do is obviously figure out where the moon is, but certain seeds, it's called seed cycling. So certain seeds help with certain hormones. So you would follow, like, for the first 2 weeks of your cycle, you'd have flax seeds and pepitas, and then the second half of your cycle you would have sunflower seeds and sesame seeds, and you add them into salads or smoothies, for instance, and they help to re-regulate hormones. So whether you're postpartum or whether you're just menstruating, they can really help with hormone health. So just doing like those small little things that you can do, obviously, with diet, whether you're pregnant or not pregnant or with kids or not, that can just add in a little, also help nutritionally wise. So there's a lot of things you can do that way as well.
Fascinating. Thanks, Ilana.
Well, it's my pleasure. Like, as I said, it's really why I created the Aligned Living membership, because one, we have yoga and meditation in there designed for women. So yoga for your winter phase of your cycle and your summer phase and your autumn phase. But then I do educate around, we do new and full moon rituals every month, and there's a women's circle to talk about all these types of topics. And I give a lot of information about how you can learn to sync with your, we'll call it innate women's natural energy, I suppose, yeah.
And do you have mostly women who haven't yet had children?
So I have a mix. I have some that are menopausal or in menopause. I have some that are perimenopause. I have some that have kids. I have some that don't have kids. I have a whole mix.
Oh, we haven't talked about menopause. Just quickly, it's my own interest probably more so than anything else, but do you recommend the same thing as tracking as
they follow the moon,
using the cycle that follow the moon, right?
So anyone that's no longer bleeding follows the moon. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Ilana. For those who want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
Obviously, my website is www.ilanak.com.au. I'm ilanak.kinesiology on Instagram and Facebook. They're probably the main 2 places that you can find me.
Well, thanks, Ilana, for joining us today.
It's been my absolute pleasure.
And before I sign off, remember, my team and I will be putting together the show notes for this episode with all the links, including how to connect with Ilana at www.fitnessmama.com/podcast, including how to access our 7-day free trial. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this episode, it would be amazing if you left a review and did a rating, and also send me and Ilana a DM on Instagram. So I'm at Fitness Mama. So I'd love to hear from you. Send me a DM and have a fabulous day, everybody. And I look forward to you joining me next week for another episode of the Fitness Mama podcast. Thanks for listening to the Fitness Mama podcast, brought to you by the Fitness Mama freebies found at www.fitnessmama.com/free. So please take a few seconds to leave a review, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and be sure to take a screenshot of this podcast, upload it to your social media, and tag me at Fitness Mama so I can give you a shout out too. Until next time, remember, an active pregnancy, confident childbirth, and strong postnatal recovery is something that you deserve. Remember our disclaimer: materials and contents in this podcast are intended as general information only and shouldn't substitute any medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I'll see you soon.